Hello, and welcome to Overthink,
the podcast where two philosophy professors talk about how our discipline has lots of rich tools for helping us think about contemporary issues.
I am your co-host, David Peña-Guzmán.
And I'm co-host Ellie Anderson. We have been getting so many listeners asking us if and when we are going to do an episode on AI. And I will confess, I have found this subject quite daunting, which is partly why we're bringing in a wonderful guest a bit later today to help us think through this topic. But I actually went to a conference last weekend called Art and AI at Cal State Los Angeles. And I want to share some thoughts from it with you, David, to get started.
You know I love conference gossip, so tell me all about it.
So much of this will be a report, but I actually do have a fun piece of gossip for you and our listeners, which is guess who was at this conference?
Elon Musk? I have no idea.
That would be extremely juicy, but less juicy in a personal way. Okay, if you remember from the emotional labor episode, how I talked about this guy that I dated who dumped me and then started dating an influencer who wrote a song about him?
Yes, I do remember that.
She was at this conference.
Oh, is she an AI influencer or an art influencer?
No, and calling her an influencer isn't actually fair. I think she has a real job, but she also did have a presence online after we stopped dating and then wrote the song about him. Anyway, she was there.
Yeah, but why was she there? Oh, because she's a musician. And so I guess art and AI, art and music?
I don't know why she was there. I don't know her. I just saw her.
I know, but now I want to know what her deal is because she was there and you were there. So this guy clearly has a type, which is women who go to AI and art conferences in LA.
That's a pretty badass type, if I'm being honest. I think, and she does seem really cool. So, yeah.
Well, did you talk to her?
No. I'm saying she just seems cool based on her social media.
I know, but you wouldn't have approached her and been like, hey, we have something in common.
Not randomly at a professional conference. Absolutely not. So moving on from conference gossip to what I actually learned at this conference, one of the speakers was Claire Evans, who is in the band YACHT and also is a really wonderful journalist. And YACHT is this great band that I've actually seen before in Atlanta, maybe 10 years ago. And they co-wrote a Grammy-nominated album called Chain Tripping a few years ago with AI.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about what Evans said is that it was actually harder to create the album with AI. Lest you think that co-writing an album with AI is being done for some sort of artistic shortcut. She said they had so many moments while they were doing this album where they were like, are we really doing this? This is so much harder than actually just writing an album ourselves, which they have done many other times in the past.
That is really surprising to me because I would have assumed that the AI would have been a shortcut. So I'm curious about why it didn't make things easier for the creation of music in the same way that it seems to be making things easier in every other regard.
One thing she said about this was that the music that AI generated did not lend itself easily to performance. It was really awkward to perform the music that AI had written because it wasn't rooted in the rhythms of the body. So she speculated that when humans are writing music, it's emerging out of their own embodied rhythms. And so it feels, in a sense, natural to perform it, especially when you're the one writing it. And that was just not the case with AI. They kind of had to make the rhythms work for them.
Yeah, and insofar as AI doesn't have a body, it wouldn't have the kind of bodily rhythms that maybe guide our own approach to musical composition. So I can just imagine the kind of lyrics or the melodies even that AI produces as being very foreign to us by virtue of, quite literally being produced by a disembodied intelligence that exists just somewhere out there in the computational ether of the world.
Exactly. They don't necessarily fit in with the rhythms that a human would sing. And the way that they created this album, because you're probably wondering, how did this actually take place, was basically two main procedures. The first was a generation of the music itself. And what they did to create the music was they trained the AI on their existing catalog of songs. I think they had 83 songs or something of that sort. And they used a thing called, my scientific terminology here is going to be somewhat lacking, but
you're like computers.
They used a thing called latent space interpolation, where you take two different melodies in this case, and the AI creates a melody that is in between those two melodies by first starting with melody A and then getting to melody B by way of having all of these melodies in the middle. And so it's moving through all of these latent spaces in the middle, and then that's where the new melody comes from. So more or less, the new melodies that the AI was generating had their roots in the existing catalog of yacht songs.
Okay.
Lyrics were a little bit different. So for lyrics, what they did was train the AI on all of the music, not only that they've created, but that they grew up listening to. It was a giant catalog of songs and a giant catalog of human-created songs, right? So the lyrics of Linda Ronstadt, say, are probably going to be better than an AI-generated lyric, but even if an AI-generated lyric is decent, it's in part thanks to Linda Ronstadt that it is decent, right? So I just want to note that at first, that there's this human creation that's behind both the music and the lyrics. And in the case of the lyrics, it's not just Yacht's human creation, but it's also that of a lot of other bands as well. Then they had AI produce lyrics from there. So they trained the AI on this huge catalog of music, and then they used the lyrics that the AI generated as the lyrics for their album. And they told themselves, we can't add anything that wasn't already in the AI-generated lyrics. They could subtract and they could sort of paste things together in different ways. Like, for instance, the AI did not have a good sense of where the chorus would be versus the verses. And so they needed to decide what would be the chorus and what would be the verse. And so they're doing this arranging themselves and figuring out what melody to put with what lyrics and also what instruments to have, play particular parts of the music that they had come up with. But they're working really closely with AI. And so it was that collaboration that caused so much trouble for them. But it created this album that ended up being nominated for a Grammy.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. But so they clearly did some editing to the lyrics, and they also did some manipulating, some judgment calls actually about what is chorus and what is verse. And you mentioned that this happened a couple of years ago. Do you know what software they used for the generation of the lyrics?
It was an earlier version of GPT, I think GPT-2.
Okay. Like you, I am not an expert in AI or in computer science, but I wonder whether things would be pretty different today, and maybe the difficulty that they experience with AI generating lyrics has less to do with there being something unique about lyrics that makes them recalcitrant to AI generation, and more to do with the particular stage in the development of AI that we were in at the time that they were collaborating with this AI. So I suspect that nowadays AI might give you the lyrics fully formed with a clear and pretty good distinction between chorus and verse even. So the musical art that you would get nowadays in 2023 from working with AI would come to you in pretty finalized form that doesn't need that further tweaking. I suspect that it might be passable from the get-go, which it doesn't seem like it was at the time.
There was this really interesting question at the conference that got at precisely this thing. The person who asked the question was wondering whether when Yacht created their album, there was, as the questioner put it, this magical moment of an uncanny valley where the AI's lyrics were still weird. Like, they didn't quite fit. And if you listen to the Yacht album, you can hear this quite a bit, which is really fun. And I think totally works with Yacht's aesthetic, because they've always worked with technology in a fun and off-kilter sort of punk way. And this questioner was like, I don't know if you would really get that with GPT-3. For instance, you could type into GPT-3, come up with lyrics that sound like a Yacht song, and it would probably be pretty accurate.
Yeah, it would produce lyrics that would actually win a Grammy this time rather than just be nominated.
Oh my God, so rude.
But I mean, for people who have seen all the experiments that people have been posting about online of asking the latest version of ChatGPT to create, whatever crazy concatenation of demands, like produce a Nicki Minaj rap talking about Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
It's shockingly successful at mirroring style and being faithful to content. And so I do think we are now past that uncanny valley and entering closer to the territory of the Turing test, where humans cannot tell the difference between lyrics that are generated by a human being and lyrics that are generated by the latest version of GPT.
I will say, though, that I do think part of the beauty of the YACHT album is in trying to make those AI-generated lyrics work according to human rhythms in a way that does inject a human element that lyrics created in the style of YACHT by ChatGPT probably would not have. Today, we're talking about AI and art.
How is image-generating AI upending the world of art?
Can we say that artificial intelligence is actually creating art or expressing itself through it?
And who is really the artist in this case? The algorithm, the coders of the algorithm, or the human users who feed instructions into it? Although artificial intelligence may not have co-written a major album before YACHT, musicians and other artists have, in a sense, been outsourcing their creative process to technology for quite some time. David Bowie wrote many of his lyrics using what is known as a verbicizer, which, in short, is a computer program that auto-generates lyrics. Mm-hmm. So while many of us think about AI in art as a relatively recent phenomenon, it actually has a longer history than most people realize. In fact, we could say that there has been computer-generated art almost for as long as there have been computers. In the late 1960s, a painter from London named Harold Cohen got really interested in the relationship between computers and art and the way in which computer programming could be used to generate new forms of aesthetic creations. And he started playing with something that he called algorithmic art that is the result of algorithmic mediation and manipulation. And what he did in the late 1960s, this started in 1968 and continued well into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, he gave a computer a set of relatively simple rules for creating images. So he gave the computer some parameters about things like lines, geometry, figure versus background, and then had the computer generate images on its own that then a little robot that was attached to the computer, they called that robot a turtle because it kind of looked like a turtle, would print these images on a surface, kind of like a mobile printer, making the images real.
So the turtle's like a glorified printer.
Yeah, it's like not even a glorified. It's like an animalized.
The turtle's a printer. Okay.
Yeah, like the turtle is a printer that's just called a turtle.
So this is really interesting, and yet it also sounds a bit different from what we have today, because what we have today is generative AI. And DALL-E, which OpenAI started, same company as ChatGPT, is the first widely accessible text-to-image generator where you can literally type in a text prompt. So I could type in, create an image in the style of Van Gogh of this turtle printer from the 1960s. It was 1960s, right?
Yeah, late 1960s.
And then DALL-E would generate something from that. This computer program that Harold Cohen started could not do something like that.
No, in the case of the program that Harold Cohen worked with, which was called Aaron, you would have to actually code for the rules rather than give it instructions in natural language, which is what we do with DALL-E, and that's also what we do with ChatGPT.
And so DALL-E, and now more and more programs like it, have made widely available something that only a few tech-savvy artists who literally knew how to code were comfortable using or even had access to.
Yeah, because even beginning from the 1960s all the way to the present moment, the majority of artists who were playing with AI were people trained in coding and knew how to code and felt comfortable around computers.
Mhm.
And in fact, the generally agreed upon date when AI generated art really shook up the world of art internationally is quite recent. And that was in 2018. What happened in 2018 is that an art collective named Obvious used this open source algorithm to create a visual work of art. It was a painting called The Portrait of Edmund Bellamy. And this portrait, which was AI generated, became the first artwork by an AI that sold at a major auction house. It sold at Christie's in 2018 for over $400,000.
Oh, wow.
When this happened in 2018, the controversy around this particular piece hinged on the fact that this art collective used an open source algorithm to create this image rather than actually writing their own code using their own tech savviness. So it seems that in 2018, the assumption was that the creative element in AI art lies in the coding more than in the way in which an average person uses a particular software. So it's about creating the software rather than about just using it to create a great work of art.
It seems like what you're saying, David, is that the creation of the work of art was not being located in that generativeness, which the AI was doing, but more in the creativity on the human side, which was due to the coding.
Yeah, so people were saying Obvious is not a real artist and their painting should not have made that much money because they didn't even write their own code. And so if you wanted to really be an AI artist, you had to be a coder first.
Yeah. Well, and now it seems like just within the space of a few years, the conversation has really changed because the focus has to do with whether the algorithm itself is artistic or whether the people using it are artists, rather than on whether coding itself is the art.
Yes.
And so, with DALL-E, the question is DALL-E the one creating the art, or is it the human putting the text prompt in, or is it not even art? And part of the reason that this all seems controversial goes back to what I mentioned Claire Evans saying, which is that for her, AI wasn't a shortcut at all. With visual arts, and the generative models that we have with DALL-E, what seems controversial is that it actually does seem like a shortcut. And this is especially the case if the artists aren't coding. They're just plugging in ideas and then generating the art from there. And this is indeed what I heard at an event a few months ago. Back in December 2022, there was an Atlantic event, a Progress Summit that I, for some reason, got invited to. And I heard this guy who worked for DreamWorks talk about how AI was replacing entire teams of animators because all they needed now were text prompts. Obviously, you still need real animators. But for instance, AI allows you to have major shortcuts in terms of thinking how a scene is going to be composed, what a character might look like. Things that used to take weeks and months, he said, would now take 3 to 5 seconds, which is really amazing if you're DreamWorks and you're driven by profits, but is obviously very scary if you're one of the animators.
Yeah, and I think the democratizing effect that technologies like DALL-E and ChatGPT had on thinking about the aesthetics of AI generation, that democratization has meant that the focus has now shifted away from who is actually creating the algorithm to the way in which people are using the algorithm in order to create a particular final product. And there, it's not so much about whether or not the use of the AI represents a shortcut, although there are also debates very much alive about that, but about what the appropriate use of language is in order to get the AI to produce a work that you intended as a human user interacting with the AI. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like I'm not getting it, but that might just be because I'm feeling like I'm not firing at full cylinders today.
No, so in short, new technologies like DALL-E and ChatGPT have had a democratizing effect where it shifts us away from caring about who created the code into thinking about how human users interact with the code in order to generate art, independently of whether it counts or doesn't count as cheating because it's a shortcut.
Yes. And that actually did come up at the conference as well in the opening remarks by the philosophy professor who organized the conference. This was Fawad Dizajibamani. And he had this really great way of putting it at the beginning of the conference where he said, the question is not, can AI create art, but rather, what does our tendency to shun or accept AI art say about what we want the arts to do for us?
Yeah, and I think when you frame the question in that way about what our willingness or unwillingness to accept AI in the context of artistic creativity tell us about us, that really allows us to understand why there are all these concerns, for example, about using AI as a shortcut, right? Because we tend to think that art is something that requires effort, that requires time, and that should cost the artist something. If you can just snap your fingers and create a work that might win an art competition, many of us might, raise an eyebrow or two. Beyond this question of the shortcut in the sense of saving time, I think a lot of people also express a worry or a reservation about the use of AI because they see the turn to computers and machines and algorithms not just as a shortcut, but really as a complete departure from their conception of art. Because for some people, computers are machines. I mean, computers are machines.
Not people for some people. Say.
No, what I meant to say is, for some people, because computers are machines, they cannot be creative in the way that is required for art. So maybe they can generate, but they cannot invent. And I think one philosopher of art who I think would take this position if he were alive today is R.G. Collingwood, who is one of the main defenders of what is known as the expressive theory of art, which links art above all to emotion. Now, for Collingwood, who lived in the first half of the 20th century, art is the expression of emotion. Usually, what drives artists to create art is that they are aware that they are having some strong emotion, but they just don't know what that emotion actually is. It's unconscious and it is unintelligible to them. So they just feel a stirring within, and they turn to art to clarify that emotion to themselves and to express it. And so according to him, it is through art that artists express their emotions and become conscious of them. Now, if we try to bring this theory to bear on this contemporary controversy around AI, we would simply say that since AI obviously doesn't have emotions, then on Collingwood's theory, it couldn't possibly be artistic. It might be productive, but there is no development of feeling and no expansion of consciousness that happens in the case of AI-generated art, because Collingwood is very clear that art is never about the emotions of the audience. It's about the emotions of the artist.
Yeah, which I might disagree with Collingwood on. However, it seems like his criticism, if we're thinking about AI, would only even really apply if we're thinking about the algorithm as the artist. If we're thinking instead about the human prompt writer as the artist, then things look a little bit different because the human user does have emotions when they're typing in create a image in the style of Van Gogh that is this printer turtle. Arguably, they can express their emotions by telling the AI what to do.
Yes, that's a very good point, Ellie. But Collingwood also distinguishes between what he calls expression, which is central to his theory, and description. He says that description is what happens when you name an emotion using language that you've already recognized for what it is. So, for example, when I say, I am angry, I am simply describing an emotion that I've already identified. And in a sense, that's what we do when we use AI. We use words to tell it what to do. Make a sad painting about this or that. Make an angry, nightmarish poem about this or that.
Yeah.
The difference there is that expression is not that. Expression is actually about the process of coming to discover the emotion before you actually know what that emotion is and before you can ever name it. And so at the beginning of the process of doing art for Collingwood, we don't know what we will find because we don't know what emotion we are trying to manifest or externalize. And that's why he says in a passage from The Principles of Art that when the artist begins to create a work of art, they actually cannot tell you if it's going to be, let's say, a comedy or if it's going to be a tragedy. And so in the case of the human prompt writer who is interacting with ChatGPT or DALL-E, the problem is that the human already knows what they're looking for. And in fact, they have to know it in order to give the instructions. And in that sense, Collingwood would say the human is not an artist either. If anything, I think the human would be a lot closer to what Collingwood calls a rhetorician.
Human artists everywhere now write grants just saying, I can't tell you whether this is going to be a comedy or a tragedy yet because I haven't had the requisite emotions yet. Please fund my play and let me see what comes out of it. Because I do actually worry that the contemporary situation of the art world kind of automatizes even human artists in any case. But can you say briefly, I love this distinction that you're drawing, David. I think your Collingwoodian analysis is fascinating here. Can you say briefly what you mean by the rhetorician?
So Collingwood draws a distinction between the artist and the rhetorician. The artist discovers something about their inner life in the course of doing art. So they discover themselves in a way. Whereas the rhetorician is somebody who masters the rules of language in order to bring about certain effects in the external world, typically in the audience.
This is exactly what people are doing with the DALL-E prompts.
Yes, except that I guess the main difference is that the rhetorician tries to manipulate an audience in order to extract a certain effect, and the human prompt writer in connection to AI would not be dealing with a human audience, they would be dealing with the algorithm, and they would be manipulating language to bring about an effect in that algorithm. But both of them, the rhetorician and the human using AI, are directed towards something external, whereas the artist has to always turn within and try to discover something about their own emotional life.
David and I are so excited to bring you the following interview, in part because we actually recorded it in person with our guest in my office. And so you can watch the video version on YouTube in addition to listening to it here if you would like. Because we recorded it in person in my office, the audio quality might not be quite up to the standards you're used to with Overthink, but we think you'll enjoy it nonetheless.
Dr. Raphaël Millière is the Robert A. Byrd Presidential Scholar in Society and Neuroscience in the Center for Science and Society, and a lecturer in the Philosophy Department at Columbia University. He is the author of a number of publications about phenomenology, the philosophy of self-consciousness, and the ways in which drugs, such as psychedelics, can alter our experience of our bodies. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Raphael, you recently wrote an article based on your research for Wired magazine entitled AI Art is Challenging the Boundaries of Curation, which is about the relationship between new AI protocols like DALL-E, for example, and just our understanding of what it means to be an artist, who is an artist, so on and so forth. And I will want us to talk about that, but can you tell us first a little bit about how art works in the world of AI for the uninitiated like us?
Of course. So there is, first of all, I have said that AI has made great strides in the past 10 years because of this new development called deep learning. So this is this new class of algorithms, computer programs, that can learn from a lot of data kind of automatically. So from the bottom up. So you feed them data, you can collect a data set, and then they can learn by themselves to do certain things, to accomplish certain tasks. As far as the algorithms that are used for artistic purposes are concerned, these are algorithms that are generative. So they are generating new pieces of text or images or audio or videos, for example. And to do that, they get trained on data, and they get trained in such a way that they are trying to reproduce some of the features that are in the data sets, including to create novel outputs. So for example, in the case of image generation algorithms, these are algorithms that typically get trained on a data set composed of images and their captions. So you can scrape these images from the internet. So just take the public internet and just grab a bunch of images. And on the internet, often you will have images that have captions, for example, for accessibility purposes. And so what you can do is ask your algorithm, can you try to guess which caption and which image go together? Try to find relationships between the text of the captions and the visual features of the images. And if you do that enough times with datasets composed of hundreds of millions, or in some cases, billions of images and captions, eventually your algorithm is going to become very good at putting together the right images with the right captions. And then you can, once your algorithm is trained in that way and becomes very good at that, you can kind of reverse the process once it's trained in the phase we call inference, which is when you generate the new things. And for that, you can feed a little bit of text to your algorithm that looks a little bit like a caption that describes a certain image. And then the algorithm will be able to produce a whole new image that is the algorithm's best guess as to which kind of image would fit that particular caption. And so that's the generative text-to-image process. You feed it a prompt, we call it, so a piece of text that describes the desired output, and then the algorithm will generate a corresponding image. And this is one of the main categories of algorithms people use for artistic purposes, because a lot of the people who operate in the realm of AI art are visual artists, and they use these new algorithms to generate images and create visual artworks. And that raises all sorts of fascinating questions, I'm sure we'll be into.
Totally. Well, and it also, I think that helps me understand or put into perspective something that I guess should have been obvious to me, but that wasn't really, which is why so many of these AI images look like composites. You know, like I feel like, especially with faces, sometimes you'll see these AI generated images that look like sort of bizarre composites of different elements of the face. I certainly think probably what immediately comes up for a lot of people, including myself, is questions about what this means for human artists, like in the labor market, like whose images are getting scraped. Maybe we can come back to that a little bit later, but I just wanted to flag that I think is of interest to me. But I'm curious where you see creation fitting in here, because I think when I hear about the debates about AI art, a lot of them have to do with whether the AI is creating the art or not. And I mean, you have, I know, thoughts on not only this, but also what the role of the person who's putting in the prompts has as, like, is this person an artist in the sense we usually think about it?
Right. Yeah. So one thing that I think is important to have in mind is that there is a really deep sense in which these algorithms are not autonomous, right? So, and that's important when we discuss questions such as, are these algorithms artists themselves, right? So essentially, you need a human in the loop in order to produce any of these images, because you need a human to input the prompt to the algorithm at the minimum to generate an image. But generally, the process that leads to the creation of images that are, offered as artistic works in the realm of AI art is more complicated. So it's not just putting a text prompt and then clicking a button. But even more generally, even in the most minimal case where you're just giving a description of an image, say portrait of a cat sitting on a mat. So you're giving a text description, is generating a picture on the basis of that description. And you might think, well, that's very, it's a very lazy process. You're just clicking a button. You don't need any particular artistic skill. But it's interesting because that's a very similar debate was going on when photography was invented, right?
Yeah.
And there was a lot of pushback with the artists, publishing the equivalent of op-eds at the time, essays in magazines, and saying this will never be art. At best, it's an attempt at archiving reality, but it will never be anything like art because it's just pressing a button. And I think we've moved past that because we, all of us in our pockets these days, we have a miniature camera and some other stuff work. I don't think that automatically makes all of us artists, right?
Yeah.
And I think we can all agree on that. So the mere ability to press the button is not making us artists. Good. And so in order to be an AI artist, an artist, as I prefer to say, using AI as a tool in their artistic toolkit and in their artistic process, you presumably need more than just access to these algorithms that are increasingly easy to use. And you need in particular, perhaps a vision, inspiration, talent, and new kinds of skills that come with crafting specific prompts that can accomplish specific results.
So let me ask you a question about this, because when I've talked to people about DALL-E and then there was DALL-E 2, I actually don't know if there's still open access at the moment or not.
Yes.
Okay. So one of the questions that I have is, when somebody puts in a prompt, do you know if I put in the same prompt back to back, will it generate the same image?
No, so it's stochastic. So there is some degree of indeterminacy in the generation of the images. Yeah.
Okay, and so I'm going to try to push back and put on my hat of the 19th century critic of photography, transposed onto the 21st century. Because I think one argument that could be made that would redeem photography, but then poses a challenge for AI art, is that at least in the case of photography, we can articulate a case for the dependence of the final product on the action of the individual in such a way that it could not have happened without the individual. And the same set of actions by the individual at the same moment would have led to the same result. So that there's a kind of codependence of product and producer. And the stochastic nature of the algorithm sort of throws a little bit of a wrench into maybe that articulation of the relationship between the two, because it would mean that maybe the creative power doesn't lie, or at least doesn't lie exclusively in the side of the artist. If anything, it might be the algorithm that adds that creative stochastic element. Or if we wanted to push it back a little bit in a different direction, we could say, well, it's not the algorithm, but the coders of the algorithm that are the real artists. And so I'm curious about that. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I think essentially that's a question about how much control the artist has over the output. And I think you can raise similar concerns or points about photography, right? So many photographers say those who are not working with the studio and with a carefully composed scene will perhaps go out in the streets and take snapshots of things they see. They don't have full control over what's happening, right? And there might be that someone, like maybe a cyclist suddenly, passes through the shot and gets captured, as part of the scene. That's maybe a happy accident that leads to a particular photograph that we deem, very interesting. There are many famous examples in the history of photography of this kind of haphazard events that lead to a particularly interesting shot. And it's not like this was under the control of the photographer in any robust sense. So I think this element of stochasticity, you can find it also in photography, even though it's not on the side of the parameters of the camera, but on the side of what's happening in the scene. So there are some respects in which perhaps the AI artist using an image generation algorithm might have less control than the photographer because of this stochastic element. There are other aspects in which they might have more control, in the sense of the stochasticity is not coming from the external world in this way. That said, there are also techniques to reduce the stochastic element. So for example, the stochasticity comes from the fact that when you generate an image, the model, the algorithm, is using what's known as a random seed to generate any particular image. You can actually make the image reproducible if you use a determinate seed, so a specific number that is seeding the initial noise added to produce the image. Without getting into the technical details, it is possible to make it deterministic, so keeping the parameters fixed such that the very same prompt with the very same model will result in the very same image. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, so it seems fair to say that on your view, you don't think that the algorithm is an artist. Mm-hmm. And it also seems fair to say that you think the prompter may or may not be an artist, in the same way that I may or may not be an artist when I'm taking a photo with my camera. Do you think that in the future that might change and we might get to a point at which artificial intelligence is becoming an artist?
I think that would take a very drastic change in the way these algorithms work.
Okay.
So one thing I would like to flag perhaps is that, sometimes people ask me, do you think these algorithms are creative? And I think there are two different ways in which we could parse that question, right? So there is a more deflationary sense of creativity or originality, in which you might say, yes, these algorithms are creative in the sense that, and that goes back to your earlier comments about the composite nature of these images. That can be a little bit misleading because sometimes people think that all these algorithms are doing is just taking some of the samples from the training data. So, for example, artworks that have been created by humans, and doing a kind of collage, just taking a head from there and maybe like a body from there and putting them together and kind of plagiarizing different artworks from the training data and putting them together. What they're actually doing is more sophisticated. So in the limit, you will have some edge cases in which indeed they might produce images that look very similar to images from the training data. But most of the time, they are capable of creating genuinely novel outputs that, don't really look like any of the specific outputs they've been trained on. So they're capable of generalizing beyond the specific distribution of the training sample. In the same way, text generation algorithm, language models, or chatbots like ChatGPT can create totally novel sentences that you've never seen before. Now, when we talk about creativity in humans, we generally assume that it comes with something more, which is intentions to realize a particular vision, for example, for an artist, right? So we have intentions, goals, intrinsic goals that, lead an artist to approach an artwork in a certain way, to draw things in a particular way, and so on. These algorithms, in my opinion, don't have anything like intrinsic goals in that sense. They don't have any desire, they don't have any vision, artistic vision, or otherwise, they don't have any intention in that sense. And so that's why I would be very reluctant to say that any of these algorithms are artists. Maybe in the future, you might have more autonomous algorithms that could genuinely form their own intentions to create something, generally have their own artistic vision. It seems like it would take a much richer set of psychological capacities than current algorithms have, and essentially would take something like a more general and human-like form of intelligence that we are still, in my opinion, quite far away from.
So when I think about one of the main challenges that people pose or that people see in the development of AI is precisely that lack of intention that is tied to the myth of the genius and the artist, the one who produces sort of from the depths of their being and generates something new. And the argument typically, especially when it comes to AI, is that because this is all sort of machinic and computational, you just cannot have that. And now I'm going to go in the other direction in this question, because there is a whole tradition of automatism in art. It's there in literature of people who have tried to write texts that are freed from any kind of subjective conscious control, where you type as fast as you can so that something automatic kicks in. And, we recognize that as art. That's been replicated in drawing, that's been replicated in painting. And so I'm wondering whether this is sort of a new version of that. And so maybe the real challenge, and this is where I'm heading, maybe the real challenge is not so much that it's automated or machinic or computational. Maybe the real challenge in the case of AI art is that it distributes the category of the artist in a way that we haven't really had before. Because with previously automated art, you still can identify the person doing that, like the, Pollock trying to spread paint on the canvas. There's still an individual. But here you have multiple individuals. You have the person putting in the prompt. You have all the people who coded the algorithm. And so it's kind of unclear where the locus of production is.
Can I just add a couple quick points to that? So one is, I think with respect to the myth of the genius, already the story is kind of complicated because in some of the main theories of genius, for instance, Kant's theory of genius, you already have this idea that the genius is overtaken by something beyond them that is outside of them. So I might even say that there it's a bit more complicated. But I would also say I think this idea of the distribution of art is new with respect to painting and this image generation, but it's not new with respect to other arts. For instance, theater and film are already distributed styles of art. Anyway, that was just to jump in, but back to David's question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's a lot there. So you're absolutely right, and this is usually what I bring up right after I say that these machines lack intentions. That is true. Many artists, you talk to them, and they will tell you, well, actually, I don't, go to my canvas having a particular vision in mind or, forming in this very procedural way a certain intention and then realizing it, but it just kind of happens. And a lot of artists working with AI algorithms will themselves be very happy to say things like, I collaborate with the algorithm or things like that perhaps we philosophers are a bit more reluctant to say. So it's interesting that it seems like, artists have perhaps a less, romanticized view of the artistic process and the and the creative intentions that go into it that sometimes we do. But I would still say, though, to push back on this, that, well, first of all, there's a long tradition of generative art that even predates the invention of computers, where you would have things like artists putting a canvas in the forest and letting the elements, do their work. And then it's a process that is much more impersonal in some sense and less intention-driven than the typical process of artistic creation. And nonetheless, I think it is still art that is made by humans for humans in a very substantial sense, right? So there is still, even though there is an intention to not project any particular human intention, as it were. So it's like a meta intention to put the canvas in the forest and just have the elements work on that canvas and then exhibit it in the museum. Or, you can think of the ready-mades from Duchamp and so on, right? So even then, I think the human intention is still important, even though the specific process of creation with the canvas, for example, or the object that's taken from a shop to put in a museum is something that perhaps was not imbued with an artistic intention. And the object or the artwork is also produced for human consumption. I don't really like that term, but like for the enjoyment of other humans. And I think that's still the case with AI algorithms, where humans use these algorithms as tools to produce artworks that are destined for other humans. With respect to your point about the distribution of artistry or artistic authorship, as it were, I think it's tricky because you could, I think this point may overgeneralize to a lot of other things. So you could say, why stop there? Why not think that the Fujifilm engineers that created your camera should be credited as well with, a particular photograph that you've taken? Or, the people who made the brush that you're using, the paintbrush, to create a painting. These are tools. I mean, they are new tools, but it seems to me that we ought to be careful not to overgeneralize descriptions of artistic, authorship, just because, there are people, engineers involved in creating these algorithms. But again, the algorithm is learning from the data set, and these engineers are not themselves by hand making artistic decisions about specific features that the algorithms should represent more than others.
Yeah. So I think this is a perfect place then to ask the labor question. I think think this should probably be our last question, although I'm sure we could talk to you all day. But I think there's obviously been a lot of concern among artists in terms of the fact that these images are getting scraped off of the internet by the algorithm and ultimately by the engineers. So there's a potential exploitation argument to be made. And so that, I think, relates to the idea of artists' existing work. So it's a sort of past, or it's a question about how we in the present and future relate to the past. But I also think there's a labor question towards the future, which is, how are artists in the future going to interact with these AI? And I was at an event a couple of months ago where somebody was talking. It was like somebody who works for, what's the company that does DALL-E and ChatGPT? OpenAI. Yeah. One of the engineers for OpenAI, talking about how DALL-E was already changing animation studios and the way that animators are iterating on different possibilities for scenes. And that seems like it could really open up human creativity in exciting new ways by allowing us like certain shortcuts. So I'm curious, like, what you think about that sort of exploitation question with respect to scraping existing images from the internet, and also like whether you're optimistic about the future for artists.
Yeah, thank you. That's also a very thorny question. I think there are legal ramifications, moral ramifications. The copyright question from a legal perspective hasn't been settled yet. So there are ongoing lawsuits, and the next few years will be very interesting. Both because traditionally, scraping data from the internet was considered fair use, but also because traditionally the outputs of algorithms was deemed not copyrightable, right? So there's a question about the protection of the copyright of artists on which the data is scraped on. There's also a question of the protection of the copyrights of artists who are using AI to create artworks, right?
Yes.
It's very complicated. I think what's interesting to me is that there is this really blurry boundary in the art world between plagiarism, pastiche, and homage, right? So there's a long, copyright is a modern Western concept, and there is a long history of artists riffing off each other, imitating each other, paying homage to each other. I mean, a lot of artists famously, Picasso has this whole series of imitating the great masters. When we look at that, we think of it as a form of homage and not something that's morally reprehensible. But there is a fine line, and all the artists that work within a certain movement, artistic movement, for example, the Impressionists or the Cubists, well, you could say, there is perhaps one artist that is the true pioneer that really is the first to create that artistic style. And then all of the others are just copying that style. But of course, we don't really see it that way, or we don't think of this as theft of intellectual property. And human artists, they also learn from exposure to other artworks. A bit like these algorithms learn, we get exposed to a kind of data set of artworks just by studying in art school and so on, and going to museums. And we use these inspirations in creation. And so it's very tricky to exactly pinpoint where, to draw the line. Where does it become plagiarism? Where does it actually infringes on copyright? And does it become immoral, for example? That said, my personal view is that I think there should be a blanket option for artists to at least opt out of scraping. So there is already a mechanism in place, for example, for web pages. If you don't want your web page to be scraped, you can add a file on your website that is traditionally named robot.txt. So it's just a text file that says to any automatic scraper that scrapes web pages, do not scrape.
We need to figure out how to do this for our website.
No, it's okay. People can scrape us. It's fine. You can plagiarize us. You can copy us.
Oh
it's
my
all
God,
good.
I do not sanction that. Anyway.
So I think we probably need some kind of standard format that can be embedded in an image in the metadata that says do not scrape or do not use to train an AI model. Mm-hmm. Right. And then, beyond that, with respect to the other part of your question, I do think it's really lowering the barrier to entry to artistic creation in a way that is a bit reminiscent of how, photography or, photo cameras have done so as well. Many people who were not particularly talented with the paintbrush were able to express themselves in a different way using a camera. But it's not just, I would say it's complicated because it's not just lowering the barrier to entry, it's also creating a new kind of skill or skill set, right? So being a photographer, it's not just being lazy and pressing a button. There's actually a whole new skill set about framing, composition, exposure, balance, and so on that comes into play. And these algorithms, similarly, you can use them in a very kind of, just take an off-the-shelf algorithm or use DALL, press a button, but most of the time that's not going to lead to something very interesting. It's kind of this generic output that we've seen a million times. That's really not very appealing. The AI artists that I found most interesting are people who actually tinker a lot. They have a very complicated process. They sometimes train their own algorithms, or they have they have a really tremendous skill set that is highly non-trivial. I think it will transform art a little bit like photography transformed art, but not only transform art by creating new media for artistic creation, but also in return maybe changing traditional media. So, for example, photography has had a really tremendous indirect influence on painting, because realistic paintings were not as appealing anymore. You could just use a camera. It's like, if you're going to do that, what's the point? So you might, as well create a more abstract painting and explore that more abstract realm. And I don't know yet what kind of similar influence AI art will have, but I would venture it will have similar effects on other traditional media.
Fascinating. Well, Raphaël, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute delight hearing you talk about your expertise, and I'm sure that our overthinkers feel the same way.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
David, this interview was so fun to do. It was great to be talking with Raphaël in person, first ever in-person interview, but also definitely gave so much food for thought and helped me, think about things in a different light. What were your thoughts on the interview?
Yeah, the more I think about this connection between AI and art, the more I become convinced that the real issue is the question of whether or not algorithms can be creative. So I'm trying to go back to that older debate.
Yeah, and the question, I thought at the beginning you said that wasn't the question you were interested in. Have you changed your mind?
Maybe so, because the reason that I think we sometimes end up in these really weird positions around AI and art, like, oh no, the art is really the human creating a prompt, or it's really the coder, or it's really the algorithm itself, is because of the intervention of computers. And they upset our assumptions about the inherently creative nature of human nature that presumably computers don't have. So I think underneath, really, we are having a debate about the possibly creative potential of man-made tools. And so if we think about it that way, the question is whether this can be art in the first place.
Well, and can I just add to that I think underlying that question is a question of whether creativity requires consciousness. Not necessarily, like you could have a view of saying that computers are or aren't creative without having a stance on whether or not they are conscious. But I think usually when we talk about this, that is underlying it. It reminds me a little bit of what we talked about in the productivity episode, which was that our capitalist focus on productivity by making us into sort of robots undermines our own potential for creativity. And I think for me, a big part of that is because I think that creativity requires not only consciousness, but a certain relation to your consciousness that is active and free.
Yes, I think you're right that, whether it's emotion, whether it's imagination or creativity, we think that there is this element that only we have that computers lack that is a necessary condition for artistic creation.
Which I do, by the way, know from our episode that we did with Hi-Fi Nation, you do not think that AI has. You do not think that AI has or ever will have consciousness.
Yeah, that's correct. I do not think AI is the right kind of thing. So when thinking about art, my intuition is to kind of close the door on the robots that are coming down the street, to the museums and to the auction houses and to the biennales.
To present their canvases.
Yeah, to present their canvases or their drawings.
Please, sir, show my work.
Or their turtle printed drawings.
It's the turtle bringing the turtle printed drawing.
Yes, but we also have to keep in mind that definition of art as creativity, emotion, appreciation is actually a relatively recent historical way of understanding art. And so here I'm going to make a point that I thought about while reading Collingwood's On the Principles of Art, which is about the history of the concept or of the very term art. Collingwood says, if you want to develop a theory of art, you first have to get clear about what you mean by the word art, what it actually refers to. And of course, since the 18th and 19th centuries, we have come to think about art as this object of appreciation that we attend to because of its beauty and that we can evaluate precisely because it incites in us certain feelings or activates our cognitive capacities in a particular way. But Collingwood says, let's be honest, that's not how people historically understood art. In Greek antiquity, art was considered a form of techne. It was just another version, basically, of carpentry, where it is about learning a technique that involves the use of tools. So the Greeks didn't recognize a distinction between painting and carpentry. And so for the Greeks, art is just a kind of techne, i.e., it's connected to the use of tools. If you move forward historically and then you arrive to the medieval period, the medievals use the Latin term ars, A-R-S, to talk about art. But for them, ars meant mastering certain tools in order to bring about certain effects. So, for example, think about ars grammatica, where you learn the rules of grammar in order to speak well. Or think about even ars magica, like the art of magic, where you learn certain rules to conjure up magically certain effects in the world.
Yeah, well, there's no conception of the fine arts before the 1700s.
Yes, and this is Collingwood's point that before, art had a connection to first and foremost tools with the Greeks, and later to rule manipulation with the medievals.
You do get, in the 1600s, there's a conception of the beaux-arts that emerges. I believe that's in the 1600s, but it really doesn't get codified in academia until the 1700s.
And so if we think about art in this modern sense of the beaux-arts, the fine arts, the beautiful arts, then yes, AI doesn't seem to fit very comfortably into the world of art. So what then I thought about in connection to this Collingwood reference to the Greeks and the medievals is that maybe contemporary AI-generated art is actually sending us back to these pre-modern conceptions of art. It's sending us back to the Greek conception of art as techne because it is about the use of tools, namely machines, namely computers. And arguably, it is also sending us back to the medieval conception of art as the incorporation or the internalization of rules to bring about certain effects, because that's precisely what we do when we use DALL and ChatGPT. We try to use language in order to manipulate the rules of the algorithm to bring about certain effects. And I like how Raphaël used the word conjuring to talk about this relationship that human users have to contemporary AI, where you have to get the prompt just right in order to bring about the right effect. So it's kind of like magic. And magic in the medieval period was precisely considered an art for that reason, because you have to learn to manipulate rules in order to change the world.
And if we acknowledge that a romantic conception of art, where it is this like free creation of the genius, is not the way that art has always been produced or necessarily should be produced, maybe we should stop worrying about this. I'm not sure I land on that yet, but I'm leaving with food for thought.
Yeah, and for me, the food for thought is that maybe contemporary AI art is just non-romantic. It's just another kind of art. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
You can subscribe to our Patreon for exclusive access to bonus videos, live Q&As, and more.
To reach out to us and find episode info, go to overthinkpodcast.com and connect with us on Twitter and Instagram at overthink_pod.
We'd like to thank our audio editor, Aaron Morgan, our production assistant, Emilio Esquivel Marquez, and Samuel P.K. Smith for the original music.
And to our listeners, thanks so much for overthinking with us.